that introduction. So yes, my name is Sabiha. I work in the Trade for Development team, which is a joint unit between the UK Foreign Office and the Department for Business and Trade. So we cover the Developing Countries Trading Scheme, which I'll talk a bit in more detail today. We also cover the UK's Economic Partnership Agreements. So these are the slightly more development-focused FTAs. There are currently 6 in Africa, and one of them is with the Eastern African Community. And we also cover, we also cover the UK's Aid for Trade programming, so the Trade Centre of Expertise. So just to give some introduction for those of you who don't know, the Developing Countries Trading Scheme entered into force on 19th of June 2023. So this has replaced the previous UK GSP, which in itself was almost identical to the EU GSP. It was rolled over. So this is a unilateral trade offer to developing countries, and it gives duty-free, quota-free tariff on the majority of goods. But we've made some quite key changes to make it sort of simpler and more generous for developing countries. So as I said, it's one of the most generous trade preference schemes in the world, both in terms of the rules of origin offer and the conditions on the scheme, as well as some of the tariffs. The scheme impacts 65 countries, covering 3.3 billion people and around £23 billion of exports to the UK each year. The majority, you'll see in the next slide, but the majority of countries on the scheme are in Africa. But we do, when we look at sort of trade volumes, the bulk of the trade tends to come from South Asia, a lot in ready-made garments. So I'll talk about that later, but one of our aims of the scheme is to sort of diversify away from just South Asia and away from ready-made garments as well. The scheme offers duty-free, quota-free trade on thousands of products and leads to an estimated £770 million per year of reduced import costs. We've got 3 core objectives of the DCTS. So we want to support sustainable growth in developing countries, so supporting export-led growth. And this ties into sort of UK's international development strategy. We also want to support UK businesses, so to develop supply chain resilience, and also give better access to UK consumers, so both in terms of reduced costs and also giving an option for a wider range of products. And lastly, we want to strengthen economic ties between the UK and fast-growing economies like Tanzania. So just to touch on the coverage of the DCTS, so as you can see from the map there, the vast majority of countries are in Africa, but we also cover quite a lot of Asia and some countries in the Pacific as well. So we've got 3 tiers on this scheme. Like a lot of trade preferences schemes, we've got the comprehensive preferences tier. So this is what's available to all least developed countries, including Tanzania. So this is the most generous offer under the scheme. So almost all products are duty-free, quota-free, apart from arms and ammunition. This is very similar to what it was under the UK GSP. Under enhanced preferences, this is the second most generous tier. So this is for non-LDCs that are classed as economically vulnerable. So we do an assessment based on their export diversification. So for low-income and lower-middle-income countries that are economically vulnerable, they get access to this tier. About 92% of those products are duty-free, but often when we look at the trade profile, it covers a larger proportion of the trade. And lastly, we've got the standard preferences tier. So this is the least generous tier under the scheme, so about 65% of products are duty-free. At the moment, this only covers India and Indonesia, and they're also subject to something called goods graduation, where some products, if they're deemed to be competitive internationally, they're graduated out of the scheme. Again, one of the aims of that is to support, to prevent preference erosion for the less developed countries. Just to summarize what some of the key policy changes are in the DCTS, so we've made some more tariff cuts. So as I said, for the LDCs, tariff offer was already very generous under the previous scheme, so we've maintained that. For enhanced preferences, though, we've made an additional, it's about 156 new tariff cuts. Most of these were in agri-products, so I think a lot in dairy and some vegetable products. And again, this benefits Tanzania in terms of some of the accumulation and also when it graduates in economic status. We've also cut what we call nuisance tariffs, so the tariffs under 2%, and a lot of the seasonal tariffs. And again, this was just to make it simpler and kind of easier for businesses to use. I'll talk in the conditions section, but because of some of the changes we've made to conditions, 8 new countries now have moved from the equivalent of the standard preferences tier to the enhanced preferences. So it's quite a big change. It's almost 3,000 new tariff cuts from that move for those 8 countries. I think in Africa that covers so Nigeria, Republic of Congo and Algeria. They're now sort of on the enhanced preferences tier. The second kind of big change we made was to rules of origin, and this was really the big win for least developed countries. So the UK is the first country to give this type of offer to LDCs under trade preferences. And I think it's in line with, I think, the Nairobi principles, which is what LDCs have been asking for at the WTO in terms of accumulation rules. So we've offered sort of simpler, more generous product-specific rules for LDCs. So one of the big changes in that is increasing the threshold for non-originating content. So about half of all HS chapters now could use up to 75% of non-originating material. So this can come from anywhere in the world, although they still need to meet the kind of end processing rules. We've made a big change for the accumulation as well. So now we have automatic extended accumulation for LDCs, including Tanzania. So they can accumulate with any other country on the DCTS, as well as the UK's economic partnership agreements. So this covers 95 countries in total. So, for example, soap manufactured in Tanzania can use something like coconut oil from Nigeria, because this is another DCTS country. It can also use alkaline salt from South Africa, because it's an economic partnership agreement. It would need to do some processing in Tanzania, but it would still qualify for tariff-free export to the UK. So in theory, all of its raw materials could come from other countries. It would still need some processing, but I think our thinking around it is that it should help with supply chain integration, and also helping countries when they move into sort of higher value goods. If you think a lot of tech products where it's, say, hard for one country to be producing all of the individual components and the batteries, this gives some more flexibility for them to source from other partners. The third change we've made is around conditions. So for enhanced preference countries, we've removed the need to sign and ratify international conventions. So again, this was in response to a lot of the public consultation, which highlighted, I think, both sort of lack of evidence for the effectiveness of it, and also the admin burden on countries to sort of keep proving that they're meeting or signing and implementing the conventions. We have, however, retained the basis for suspension. So in sort of serious and systematic violation of sort of human rights and labour rights, sort of 28 conventions, a country can be suspended from the scheme. I think we've broadened it also to include some on climate change and environment. It is worth noting, though, I think our approach as a policy team is that we don't want to suspend countries unless it's a very serious situation. So the UK hasn't suspended any country so far, and we've committed to quite a lengthy process, including sort of seeing representation and various sort of warning and assessment procedures if a suspension were to happen. And lastly, around goods graduation, so this is a bit less relevant for Tanzania, but for the standard preference countries, we've refined the process, so we do it by HS chapter now, rather than GSP section, in terms of which goods are graduated out of the scheme. So again, hopefully this supports or prevents sort of preference erosion for less developed countries. I won't touch on stats too much because I think it's been mentioned in previous presentations, but just to highlight that between 2020 and 2022, there was an average of £24 million of goods exported from Tanzania to the UK each year. Over 99% of this is eligible for duty-free access to the UK. So this is a mixture of the DCTS and also the UK's MFN, or sort of UK GT tariff, which is already quite generous. We estimate there's about £173,000 of tariffs saved on exports to the UK from Tanzania, but hopefully as the trade sort of increases in the future, this number will also increase. And then when we look at sort of the sector breakdown, we see quite a high proportion of the exports are in vegetable products. So again, this is just looking at those eligible for DCTS, and also sectors like machinery and textiles. And just to say, this is good for us as well, because as I was saying, when we look at the breakdown of trade under the scheme, it does tend to be really skewed towards ready-made garments. So it's nice to see that, yeah, from Tanzania it's a bit more diversified. And yeah, sort of linked to that, we're doing quite a bit of work in the team around supporting export diversification. So over the scheme as a whole and also within individual countries. This is just some very initial analysis by from ITC, which is the International Trade Center, and just looking at sort of, I think they look at supply and demand and certain export barriers, but just looking at some suggestions for export diversification. So I think there's, to summarize it, they talk about diversifying within the agricultural products. So, you know, there's potential to increase exports in things like raw cane sugar and preserved tuna, and also within the textile sectors, so, for example, women's trousers and jerseys. We also hope that the DCTS's more liberal rules of origin will help to support some of this diversification. And yeah, we really want to see an increase in trade from Africa and Tanzania under the scheme. Just to touch briefly on the UK's Aid for Trade offer. So yeah, the UK invests a lot of overseas development assistance into Africa. Part of my wider team is the UK's Trade Centre of Expertise, so it provides sort of technical support to tackle challenges that a lot of developing countries face when exporting to the UK. So this covers things around, for example, in standards. So there's a program that works with the British Standards Institute, and it offers sort of institutional support. And I think this operates in quite a few countries in Africa, so supporting like their testing facilities and getting the right certificates to support exports. The Centre of Expertise also has some programs in the multilateral space, so helping LDCs with their accession to the WTO, and also in some of the negotiations. And then also making sure the trade is inclusive. So for example, there's a program that specifically targets female entrepreneurs in developing countries, kind of offers technical assistance and then brings them over to trade fairs in the UK. Some examples of Africa-wide programs include Trademark Africa, which aims to sort of reduce logistical costs and also time for trade within Africa. So it's sort of linked to the CETA implementation as well. And I think there's some infrastructure projects and also some technical assistance under that program. There's also Growth Gateway, which is like an advisory service. So supports UK businesses and investors and African businesses and investors to sort of make connections and if they have any questions about opportunities. Within our wider team as well, there's also the UK's Trade Partnerships, which again it runs through the International Trade Center in Geneva, but we've been doing some work in Tanzania. So I think primarily the focus so far this year has been in textiles companies. I think under the program, 4 firms went to a big expo in Ethiopia earlier this month, and there are plans for 3 to 4 firms to also come to the Source Fashion Show in London in 2024. And the firms that come, they receive a mixture of sort of technical assistance, so coaching, and like support with matchmaking with buyers at the trade fair, and also things like marketing and improving the brand image. Just to say, I think we can share these slides after, but there are a lot of resources that we've produced around the DCTS launch to support exporters and also UK importers to use the scheme. So there are various digital guides available online, including on things like the customs process, rules of origin, also trade standards, just like an initial starting point with where to find information on different gov.uk sites. And there's also sort of a tariff tool where you can type in your product and see trade from sort of competitors or other countries on the scheme, so you get a sense of where some opportunities might be. Just to touch on what we're planning to do in the future, so there are some policy changes that we are sort of doing some research and consultation on that will hopefully be implemented in the next year or two. So we have an ambition to make an Africa-wide accumulation group in the DCTS. So at the moment, Tanzania, because it's an LDC, already can accumulate with most of the countries on the continent. But we want to include a separate group so that when it graduates, and also for other countries that are on that economic enhanced preference tier, so countries like Nigeria, so that they can accumulate with all other countries on the continent. So again, this sort of links with ambitions of supporting AFCETA. We're putting together country implementation plans as well, so we want to increase utilisation of the scheme and also support diversification. So we're putting together plans with various colleagues at the embassies abroad on how to increase its utilisation. Thirdly, I think another policy change that we're planning is around some of the rules of origin in the textiles industry. So again, because Tanzania is an LDC, it's already very generous for the textile rules of origin, but as it graduates, it becomes a lot more restrictive, and I think we've been told a lot of countries struggle to meet those rules of origin in textiles under the enhanced preference. So we're planning to make some changes, most likely on the non-originating content threshold. But we'll do a lot of comms around that once that change is implemented. And lastly, we're also doing kind of a multi-year study of the DCTS, so particularly looking at what the impact of the rules of origin changes have been, if there have been any impact on the supply chains. And I think our aim is that we do a lot of work at the WTO, so sort of advocating for other countries to make similar changes to their preference schemes. So this would be a good kind of evidence base for that. Yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to take questions, but not sure if there's time.
Any questions?
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy. We can share the slides after, and happy to answer over email as well. Thanks.
A round of applause for Thank you very much. That was quite a lot, I know, and happy to take any questions, comments on this, and we'll be more than happy to share with the presentation. I know DCTS only 4 months since it was launched, so it's quite new for both of us. Now we are actually on time for